the addiction that I had was my primary objective.
Right.
Like in actuality, if you looked at my actions, they were all about getting high and then about my kids. At that point, they flipped for me. And I was like, I could pursue this, and continue on trying to get loaded and trying to figure it out. But I will probably not be able to stay in my children's lives if I do.
Hey y'all, what's going on? Welcome back to the Stacking Days podcast, where we highlight underrepresented journeys of sobriety within the Black and Brown community. I'm really excited today. I know I say that probably every episode, which is true, but I'm exceptionally excited today for the guest that we have on. We have Laura Cathcart Robbins on, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with who she is and what she does, she's pretty multifaceted, extremely talented. She's a published author, a writer, a podcaster. If you look into her any more closely, you'll recognize that she's also thriving in long-term recovery and really, occupies a special space, in my opinion, in the recovery community. So I'm really excited to have her on to just share her journey and to talk shop. So Laura, welcome to the Stack of Days podcast.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's get right into it because I know that there's probably a lot of meat and potatoes that we're going to get into. But for those of who are listening out there who are unfamiliar with your story, can you kind of bring us back to the beginning of your relationship with substances? I know that we're talking about more here than just alcohol and ultimately Ambien, but bring us back to the beginning and how you kind of found yourself in bed, so to speak, with your substances, what you struggled with, and we'll kind of just move along from there.
Well, I was telling you that I just came from my yearly physical, and my doctor he just asked me the same thing again, and I've told him this story before,
Okay.
but he seems to have amnesia when it comes to me. I think when he sees me, he doesn't equate it with the story that I give him, so it kind of wipes it out. But I was telling him that I was somebody who started drinking a little bit later than my peers, meaning not until like late teens. And I didn't like it. I really didn't like it. I would pretend to drink a lot more than I was. I would dump beers in the bushes and, you know, I just went along because I really liked the camaraderie of it. But it was after my kids were born that I believe I was treating undiagnosed postpartum anxiety and depression. And not only did alcohol seem to really help with that, but the sleeping pill that I was prescribed then as well, which was Ambien, seemed like the panacea to me. Like that was literally the magic pill that I could take and not only get a full night's sleep, it did something to me that it doesn't seem to do to most people, which is it got me high.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't expecting that from that pill, but I really, really liked it. And I started to rely on it as like, I had 2 kids under the age of 2. And I had them back to back in 98 and 99. And they're both what they call now spirited children. But then it was just like they got too much energy, like
Yeah.
somebody. And I, I was an at-home mom and my job was them pretty much. And I poured myself into it, but I think I just didn't reserve anything for myself. And I felt very much like the victim. And like I was giving more than I had. So these, the ability to take a pill and possibly a drink at the end of the day seemed like the treat that I deserved. And that worked out well for me for a short period of time, relatively. And then as people say, the drinking and pills were my solution. And then my solution became my problem, because the benefit that I got from them, my tolerance grew. So I needed more in order to get the same benefit. And the more that I needed to take was poisoning me, basically. So I would drink more and I would take more Ambien, and I was chasing that same effect that I got in the beginning. And I did that for years. until you're really kind of, I want to say my body gave out, that sounds more dramatic than it was. Because when I actually chose to get sober, the physical part of it wasn't as obvious, but I couldn't get sober. I couldn't be sober and I couldn't get high anymore.
Mm,
I couldn't get where I needed to get. And being sober was excruciating because I was so addicted.
mm,
So that's when I decided to get sober. And in the meantime, my book stash and my life in hiding is about a 10-month period of my life during which I I have a grand mal seizure that's a withdrawal seizure right at the beginning of the book. I ask for a divorce from my long-term marriage. I'm asked to be the parent association president at my kids' school, and I'm asked to join the board at their school. So I have this very, very solid double life that I'm leading, and it was starting. The foundation of it was crumbling, and that's why I decided to get help.
yeah. Thank you for sharing all of that. I really do appreciate it. I think back to kind of like the inception of the postpartum depression and the anxiety. Now, and I don't know if those two things can be mutually exclusive or if one comes with the other, but is anxiety something that you had always kind of dealt with, or was it exacerbated once you became a mother of two young ones? And which, I mean, I have two young ones as well, and I've seen my wife try to recover from giving birth to two, and and for any women out there who've given birth and who are raising children, I mean, literally, I mean, hats off to you. It's one of the
Yeah.
most challenging things, and so I can imagine. But I guess the question is like, did you feel the anxiety, and was it kind of uncovered through your early days of motherhood, or did it kind of all onset you at once, which is sounds like a perfect storm?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have never identified as an anxious person, even when I was dealing with that, and I don't identify as an anxious person now, and I didn't before I gave birth to my two sons. Um, I This is another reason why it was so baffling to me because I didn't understand what these feelings were, and I really I thank you for that question because I want to clarify. I didn't give birth and become anxious about everything. I gave birth and I became anxious about my kids.
Hmm.
And and it wasn't like I was worried that something was gonna harm them when they left the house. It wasn't that kind of anxiety. My anxiety was specific to if they cry and I don't hear them, I don't want them to cry any longer than they need to. Once they're up, I want them to be in my arms. Like, I was worried about them experiencing an absence,
Yeah,
which was, I was in the same house with them, but I didn't want, all those pre-waking whimpers that babies do, where they're maybe just stirring, that would set me up like a fireman. Like, I'm boots on, uniform on, ready to grab them out of the bassinet or the crib or whatever it was and make sure that they didn't feel like I wasn't there with them. And that's really where my anxiety was. The the kicker for that is this was mainly at night and I didn't sleep
yeah,
as a result of this. So what happened to me during the day was an extension of that anxiety, but I didn't know how to identify it that way because I was then sleep deprived. And so I was short-tempered and I was shaky and I was not eating well. And these were things that I didn't know if they stemmed directly from the anxiety I was experiencing at night with my boys or from the lack of sleep.
yeah,
I didn't know which was fueling this feeling in me that was entirely foreign.
yeah,
And so when I got the Ambien and not only did I get to sleep, but that feeling went away, then I was like, "Oh, well, I'll just take this the rest of my life, and I won't ever have to feel this again," whatever this foreign feeling was, which is one of the reasons I asked my doctor, my OBGYN, if I was experiencing postpartum depression because I didn't have the language for what I was experiencing. All I had ever heard was postpartum depression.
yeah,
But I didn't have those symptoms. I wasn't flat. I wasn't listless. I wasn't crying. I wasn't feeling distant from my children, like a lot of the things that a lot of women who give birth are feeling that fall neatly under the heading of depression. I wasn't experiencing those things. So I was kind of dismissed out of hand as not having that.
Mm,
Um, and so self-medicating became even more of an option
mm.
because I didn't want to feel like that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, how disorienting that must have been to have your need to be vigilant for your children to drive you to even more sleepless nights and deprivation. You know, if parents experience that anyways,
Yeah.
and then anxiety. I can only imagine. And then I'm sure that when you talk about, and we don't have to go too deep into this, but when you talk about this mommy wine culture of today, and I'm not a mom, I'm a dad, but I'm assuming that there are corners of mommy wine culture where that very much is a reality, where a lot of these mothers are anxious, are deprived of sleep, are trying to identify themselves again in coming back from giving birth. So it sounds like it was a really challenging time for you. And so I guess the question that I have is, how did you get to a point where you took a more critical look at your situation and said, okay, I actually need to get some help here. Like, I understand that the wheels started to come off a little bit more than you were comfortable with, but that period seemed to coincide with so many other big moments in your
Yeah.
life. How did you navigate those?
Yeah, and thank you for that question as well. I mean, I mentioned that right at the beginning of the book, I actually have 2 grand mal seizures, twice in, one right after the other. And if I were reading the book, I would think that's the bottom where she's gonna go get help
Hmm.
now, but that wasn't the case for me. I was actually given a prescription override, as a result of those seizures because the doctors got together and decided that it was the fact that I ran out of Ambien that was the culprit and not no one looked at whether or not I was addicted to it.
Right.
And so, what I kind of had was a free pass, I thought, and I thought once I had that, that I wouldn't need to be married anymore.
Gotcha.
And I could just, go and live my life with this huge pile of Ambien. And the truth was that I kept running out of that too. Like, there's a saying in some sober support groups that one is too much and 1,000 is never enough, or something to that effect. And that was the case for me. Um, so, a few months later, it was July of 2008. I just got really clear, and I was at that point. I'd had a moment where I realized that being sober was too hard and I couldn't get loaded anymore. And there wasn't enough to get me loaded even if I could get loaded anymore. And there was just no place for me to go. And my primary objective at this time was to stay in my children's lives. And it was at that moment that the objective in my head was always, that's my kids. But really, the addiction that I had was my primary objective.
Right.
Like, in actuality, through if you looked at my actions, they were all about getting high and then about my kids. So at that point, they flipped for me, and I was like, I could pursue this, and continue on trying to get loaded and trying to figure it out, but I will probably not be able to stay in my children's lives if I do. And I had a moment of grace or clarity or whatever you wanna call it, and I literally made a call. That call was to my mother, and said out loud for the first time that I needed help with this, that I was abusing it, and I was terrified that it was going to be used against me, and I didn't think that I could hide it anymore. I was sure that I couldn't hide it anymore, and, in retrospect, I was terrified of the wrong thing because it wasn't whether or not I could hide it, it was killing me.
Hmm.
I was taking lethal doses of this and washing it down with booze at the end of the day, which makes it a fully lethal dose. And I didn't die, and I didn't die, and I didn't die, and I don't know why.
Hmm.
But I didn't understand that's what I was doing at the time. I really thought I was just trying to get back to a level where I could participate in life. And so, with that recognition and then the phone call to my mom, I secured a bed for myself in a treatment facility because the seizures had shown me that I couldn't do what you did, which, just show up either at a meeting or at a doctor's office. I needed to be confined somewhere where I could be medically detoxed. So I knew that, and that's what I did.
Yeah. I think that's an important call out as well, right? Like for me, I didn't know what I didn't know. And I just kind of like stopped and went to my GP, knowing what I know now, that probably was not the smartest thing to do. I probably should have gotten, but hindsight is always kind of 2020. Um, Talk to me about your early days then. I mean, it sounds like, so I know you talk about this in the book, but for those who are hearing your story for the first time, and I suggest they go pick up the book, but for those
Mhm.
who are hearing this for the first time, what did those early days look like for you? Because I think you were in rehab for, was it 30 days or 60 days
Yeah,
initially?
30 days.
30 days. So what did that look like for you? I mean, you're obviously in a place that you put yourself into, but I didn't get the sense that you necessarily wanted to be there. So tell me about that tension.
Yeah. I hated it. I hated it there. I did not want to be there. If you can picture me with my arms folded and dark glasses on and my lips pursed, sitting in the back of every room I was in, that was me throughout my time there.
Mm,
And I was not confined. I went there voluntarily. I stayed voluntarily. The suggestion was that I stay for 30 days, which my divorce lawyer liked a lot. She really liked the idea of me going and getting some kind of certificate of rehabilitation. She thought it would really help my case. I was all about my case. And this was all, in prep for if my soon to be ex husband at that time were to challenge me for custody, because we didn't know if he would or not. So this was like, but if he does, we want to have these things lined up. And I really wanted to be prepared if that were the case. So I went through it. I did not believe that I belonged there. I was the only Black one there.
mm,
Um, I was one of the older ones there at 43 and turning 44. And I just felt like, and they all seemed like they were really much worse off than I was. Like,
mm,
they were like heroin addicts or like, multiple DUIs. And, I'd had those seizures, but I'd never gotten arrested. I'd never put a needle in my arm. I very much thought that I was better than basically everybody there. And I really honestly went through my entire 30 days that way.
mm,
Without any humility at all. I was terrified. I also just really hated being in a communal room. I didn't like sleeping with other women in a room. I didn't like sharing a bathroom. All the things that I understand now why they have you do. Um, I really had a hard time with it. It seemed that I had a harder time than anybody else did. And, I had a couple of saving graces. I had Scott, who I met the hour I checked in, who really helped me through that time. I had my roommate, Laura, which is her real name. She and I share the same name, birth year, and birth hospital,
hmm. Very cool.
and in Chicago. And she was my roommate for a while, and she really saved me. I don't know that I would have stayed without the two of them, honestly, but I did. I stayed. I was determined to learn nothing. I didn't think there was anything that I needed to learn from them, so I kept my ears closed, even though I looked like I was listening and taking stuff in. And and then I left and came home, and it was, leaving my kids was by far the hardest thing I've ever done. But coming home was a really close second.
Mm,
I had dreamt of nothing else but to snuggle with them and hear about whatever they were doing during the day and do things with them. And when I got back, everything felt like, my skin had been removed. Even being with my kids, I didn't know how to be.
mm.
And the divorce had progressed. So I was closer to, signing papers at that point, but we weren't there yet. It was very nothing was settled or solved yet. And I felt really sorry for myself during those days.
When you look back on that period now, what do you think was driving that sense of discomfort? Was it being driven by where you came from? Was it being driven by a sense of, maybe a feeling like you abandoned your children for a period of time. Like, what, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but where did this sense of reentry discomfort come from? Or because I also think about it from the standpoint of, you've gone through these 30 days of almost like this, Laura appointed, rehab, and now your recovery has to start, right?
Mhm.
Because you are um, trying to satisfy a prescription in order to get to an end, which is obviously, a divorce, where you come out as unscathed as possible in the process.
Right.
So
Right.
what's driving this discomfort in that you're doing the right things, right? Um, but you're coming back into a world that, is a little shaky.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I had some hope when I left that I would just get detoxed and I wouldn't have to be sober.
Hmm.
Um, and I have a pretty long story for my life, but basically, I didn't graduate. I didn't make it past ninth grade in high school. I never went to college. I ended up working, entertainment adjacent in Hollywood, and then opening the only Black owned entertainment PR firm in Los Angeles and running that for a number of years. And I felt like I had a workaround for everything. It's like, oh, I don't have an education, but I can work harder and be more disciplined over here and still get to the same place that somebody who got their master's can get, because, you just have to know how to hustle.
Yeah,
And I could hustle my way out of
yeah.
everything.
You've done it before.
And
You can do it again.
I've done it in almost every other area of my life.
Yeah.
And so I really thought that when I went to treatment, this was a hustle I just hadn't figured out yet.
Mm,
And I think the shame that I came home with was the realization that I wasn't going to be able to hustle my way out of this, that I was going to have to accept and admit, not just to myself, but to the world, that one, I had what I call alcoholism, and addiction, and that I was an alcoholic and an addict. And because I've had these two new identities added to the identities that I'd already accumulated and curated, um, they were part of me now, and I didn't want them to be.
yeah. I was
I did not want them to
I was
be.
going to say,
Yeah.
accepting them kicking and screaming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that surrender was like, dropping a weapon for me. If I could have shot my way out of this somehow, I would have, and there was just no way to do that.
Mm,
So I had to put it down and, essentially for the first time in my life, do things the same way other people did, which I really felt was beneath me.
mm,
Like, I really felt like I shouldn't have to do anything the way other people did, because other people were joiners. They liked communal stuff. They enjoyed, doing things at the same pace and getting the same results. And that's something that I never identified with.
mm,
And now I had to deal myself into that life.
mm. It's a real honest it's a real honest depiction. I love that. I didn't want I mean, I hear you. It's like, the shit was below me, and it took me a while to come to terms with who I needed to be in order to accept who I am.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
that's deep. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are, we'd really love it if you could leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcast or a rating on Spotify. And of course, please feel free to invite somebody into the conversation. If you feel like you have a story to share on the podcast, why not apply to be a guest? You can do so by completing the form on the podcast description or find it on stackanddays.com. That's stacknday's.com. But for now, let's jump back into the conversation. I mean, the memoir, or frankly, it's an odyssey. My life in
Mhm.
in hiding. It's powerful, and I think I felt that there was a moment in this 10 months that you cover in the book where you started to come out of hiding. And I'm curious if I picked it up in how you were attempting to put it down in the book. So the question that I have for you: at what point did you start to come out of that hidden place that you
Mhm.
had spent so many years in? Did it in fact happen over those 10 months over the course of your reentry and ultimately reconciling your marriage? Like where did the hiding start to become something you confronted and started to move in an opposite direction of?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely it started then, and it was definitely a process for me. I think, one of the first places it started was the day that I left treatment, where one of the nurses, the nurse who gave me my meds, stopped me before I left the med window and said, she grabbed my wrist and she said, "Oh my God, Laura, the lights are back on in your eyes."
Mm.
And I was so irritated that she said that to me. Like, I was like, "What does she mean? Like, when were my lights off?" And I took it really personally, but there was something else inside me that warmed immediately to that, and I felt my eyes filling with tears against my will.
Mm.
And I like, she got me. She got me with that comment in that moment. I understood that something had shifted in me that was visible from the outside.
Mhm.
And I didn't like it, but I understood that there was something happening, something bigger than me.
Mm.
Because of my own volition and will, nothing would have changed. But something had indeed changed over this period of abstinence, which I think was really critical for me. Like, I needed 30 days absent, um, not absent,
Abstinence.
abstinent.
Yep.
Thank you. Absent too. I needed to be away from everything, but I also needed that abstinence to so that I could begin healing. And not everybody does, but it was really critical for me to be removed from any access to the Ambien or booze or even my kids,
Mm.
because that was part of the cycle and I needed to be removed from them too. But I you couldn't have told me that then.
Yeah.
But that was one of the moments. And, another moment was when my older son got sick, and this medication that I really like got delivered to us by mistake. And I sat up all night trying to figure out, well, really just wanting to take it. Um, and I didn't end up taking it. I was kneeling on my closet floor with it at like 4 in the morning,
Wow.
and I was just about to open it and take it. I had wrestled with it since, like about, well, ever since I got it. And he put his arms around my waist in that moment, his very warm, feverish arms, because he was really sick,
Mm.
and said, "Mommy, I need you." And I ended up not taking it and going, like, laying back in bed with him and giving this unopened bottle to my ex-husband when he showed up the next day and said, "Can you please take this out of the house?" And that was a really big moment for me, because typically I would have hidden it. You're talking about, when did the hiding stop? I would have hidden that bottle, stashed it for a later time,
Sure.
maybe when I wasn't with my kids or when I really needed it. And that was, again, it felt like something bigger than me acting on my behalf in that moment. Like, "No, we're gonna give this away. You're not gonna take it, and we're gonna give this away." And then, um, I really the more permanent shifts happened to me in therapy
Mm.
with my beloved therapist, Margarita, who I just loved. She's no longer with us, but she w she was really the first person I was honest with about what was going on. And I was only honest with her at first because I thought I would see her for a couple months and then I would never see her again, and she was bound by law to never repeat anything I said. And she was like a sorceress, man. Like, she got in there and had me look at some really hard things about myself that I didn't wanna look at. She allowed me to get sleep again, because I was a chronic insomniac, and I thought I wouldn't be able to sleep anymore. And, with the talk therapy that she provided with me, she didn't provide medication, she wasn't a psychiatrist. I was able to sleep, and I've been able to sleep for the last, coming up on 16 years next month. So, uh, I employ her methods, and she saw me in a different way than anybody else had expressed to me before. As a very definitely flawed human being, but she saw me as very fixable.
Mm.
Like, we can work on this. We can work on this. We'll make progress on this. And maybe because I had never come clean to anybody before, I had never gotten that response, but she was the first person who gave me that response. So she was really the beginning of the end of my hiding.
She seems like she was an extremely sage individual in addition to being a practitioner.
Yeah.
And also, I'm sure she appreciate the accent that you used in dictating her character on the book. I thought it was fantastic. It certainly mixed things up a little bit. So thank you for that. She was, I mean, there was, when you talk about sleep, for example, there was one point where I think she had mentioned something along the lines of, don't seek it out and it'll
Yes.
come to you. That really stood out to me. Um, Sleep is important for those who are in recovery. Just that rest and recuperation and healing, a lot of that happens when we're able to kind of turn things off. And so I think that similar to you, I've had a therapist that has helped me out quite a bit in like confronting things that otherwise I've just probably inconveniently have placed in places that that I probably needed to address them. So
Yeah.
I totally get that.
Can I just say something about her accent?
Yeah.
Um, so typically, I found this out afterwards. I didn't realize this. They hire actors to do audiobooks,
Hmm.
the publishing companies, houses. And I was like, I don't need an actor to do mine. I'm a podcaster. Like, I'm really familiar with mics and studios. Like, I can do this audiobook. And they didn't want me to do it. My agent fought for it. And so they finally gave me the contract for the audiobook. And it was this really big production. I didn't understand that I couldn't just record it at home in our home studio. There was a
Right.
director and a producer, and it's you record for like 8 hours a day, like 5 days or 6 days in a row. And when we got to Margarita's part, they're like, "We need you to do the accent." I'm like, "Oh no, I'm not doing her accent. That seems like cultural appropriation or something. Like that doesn't seem right."
Yeah.
And they're like, "You must do the accent." And so they worked to get me to do it because I wouldn't agree to do it, and we were losing time. So I finally agreed to try. So it feels really good to hear you say
Oh
that I
man,
did a good job with it.
it
So
was
thank
it
you.
was it was flawless. I was listening to it and I was like, and so I was waiting for that for her to come back into the memoir as you were kind of going along. So
Yeah.
I mean, I
Yeah.
love the backstory. It worked out well. Just if you hadn't
Yes.
heard that from anybody else,
Thank you.
you,
Thank you.
yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, let me segue then. So, like, speaking about like being the only one in the room, which is the title of your podcast, which is fantastic. And again, if anybody hasn't listened to it, it's an amazing podcast, and Laura literally has folks, everything from porn stars to professors on there,
That's
talking about pretty much everything, and them being the only one. It sounds like that's an experience that and a through line in your life, and it certainly has come through very publicly in you authoring your memoir and then ultimately becoming the narrator of your own book.
Yeah.
So my question is, in being the only one in the room, I've read a bunch of quit lit. I'm sure that you are familiar and either have read or even probably friendly with many of quit lit authors. You are, as far as I know, one of the only ones, if not the only one. What's your perspective on the recovery space and community right now, when there are so many individuals out there who do look like you, who have similar experiences to you, but their stories aren't actually being told? I mean, it's one of the reasons why I started Stacking Days. I have my perspectives on it, but you've been sober now for 16 years. So what you saw in 2008, relative to where we are today, that's a bunch of data points to be able to pull from.
Yeah.
So what's your POV on all of this?
Um, books are, I mentioned that I didn't finish ninth grade and I never went to college. Books have been my education. I don't have a formal education, but I do consider myself to be educated because I've always read. The only way I ever know how to navigate anything is through books, the books that I've read. I come up against a situation, I can, go back in my head to see like how this person handled it in whatever book I read about it, and that's the path I'll take.
Mm.
When in 2008, when I was before I checked myself into treatment, when I was looking to figure out another way, because I'd always figured out other ways to deal with what was, I was struggling with. I tried to discreetly kind of comb bookshelves in my neighborhood looking for books about what I was going through written by people who look like me. And as you mentioned, there I found none. I found almost nothing but white women. There were a few white men. I I didn't find any Asian women. I didn't find any Latina women. I did not find any black women. I didn't find any men on that side either. I didn't find Asian men, Latina men, or black men. And I thought maybe I'm looking in the wrong bookstore. Like maybe, and it wasn't so much like in 2008. It wasn't like all Amazon all the time. Like bookstores were really where it was at. I looked at libraries, I really looked around, and I was pretty stunned to find that there was nothing. And I did buy and check out some books written by white women that were really helpful to me, but not helpful in the same way as if that they had been written by someone who looked like me, because it is a different experience. Uh, when one is othered anyway, and then going through disease or whatever, or grappling with a situation where one's othered anyway, right? Because I'm othered because I can't stop drinking. I'm othered because I can't stop taking pills. I'm othered because I'm a mother doing these things.
Hmm.
And then I'm othered because I'm the only black person in the space with these issues. So it was a lot, and I kind of piecemealed myself, a way to navigate this through the books that I found. And in 20, I don't know, not 2012, it was probably 2018 or so when I first started looking at, like, am I going to write a book about my life? I started looking on the bookshelves again. This time I did have Amazon to comb through, and I still found nothing. And that's not to say that there aren't books written by Asian people, Black people, Latina people. I'm gonna close my curtain, because I think there's a crane here, really big crane.
Oh, good.
Anyway, um, there are books written by people of color, and they're really wonderful books. What I'm talking about are books that are currently on shelves.
Hmm.
Um, and that's really a big deal. You can find something that's been out of print for a while. You might get lucky and find something that was big in the 70s, but as far as like circa 2024, there just aren't any. Jessica Hoppe has a book coming out um, this summer. I think she has it's
Hmm.
coming out in July. And that's, she's Latina, and she's telling her story of recovery in her family, which is amazing. There's my book that came out last March of 2023. Um, and then you have a lot of people who self-published, right? And so their books are out there, but you're not going to walk into a bookstore and find those books on shelves typically.
Hmm.
So, the pickings are very slim. And the reasoning, I think, for that is that publishing houses just don't think they'll make money. They're making a lot of money from white women who are buying these books, and other people besides white women are buying these white women's books because they're they're like, this is the only,
That's
this
all
is
that's
the
all
only
in the
thing out
menu.
there. Yeah. And so publishing houses are like, if we did a black book, about the black experience, like, who's really going to buy that? Because typically this isn't who we're seeing coming to the table to buy these books. And so Stash, I thought, was really important. One, Simon and Schuster and Atria, they took a big gamble on an unknown memoirist who was writing, a black woman writing about her addiction. And addiction memoirs are the hardest thing to sell anyway.
Hmm.
They just are, unless they're celebrity memoirs. They're just, people have to be interested in you. And if they don't know who you are, then they're probably not going to buy your book.
Hmm.
And to give me a six-figure advance for it, which is what they did, and they were very generous, and they put a lot of money in marketing behind Stash. And I really think they wanted to test the waters and see if a book like this would do well. And my hope is that because of their experience with my book, not just Simon and Schuster and Atria, but all the big five publishing houses, Hatchet, HarperCollins, Random House, I hope they all start to look at this as like, wow, this was successful. There is a market for Black women's stories. And I'll just tell you one more thing. The irony is that, you know, uh, 10 to 1, the comments I get, the people that show up in my book events are white women.
Hmm.
They're coming out. They have went hard for Stash, and I'm so grateful to them. But I still don't know that word of it is reaching these Black markets where we hear a lot of talk about addiction, but very little discussion about recovery.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. I'm curious that in within that ecosystem, the reason why it is not making it into those markets, into markets where our people are, is probably because they're not accustomed to marketing into those communities, and it's
Yeah.
all it literally is like a literary desert, literary desert. So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy when, like,
Mhm.
obviously, no, Black folks aren't going to buy your books because you don't sell to them.
Right.
So I for that reason, I'm glad that you put it out there. I'm glad that Simon and Schuster backed it, and it sounds like it's still making incredible headway. um
Yeah. Yeah, there the New York Times really helped. Each time there were 3 times last year where the New York Times featured it,
hmm,
and because of that, it got these big bumps and got it into more hands, and it's in other places like Elle Magazine, um, Oprah Daily featured it twice. So there were other places that did, and, it's it's quite surreal, right, to have that out there, and it's not really me that they're featuring, but it's my book, which is my story.
right.
So that's interesting, but I also get a lot of Black women who find it and kind of come to me with an attitude like, "How come I never knew this was out here?"
Mm.
And I'm like, "I don't know, I've been trying." I'm a little Instagram going,
Yeah, I get it.
but there's only so much I can do, but you're right, there's a whole market that people just don't know how to market to, and they also seem reluctant to put the resources behind learning how to do that,
Yeah.
right?
I'm not necessarily one to. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but when you mentioned earlier that we don't have the conversation, or at least the conversation around recovery um, isn't prevalent within communities of color in the Black community. Why do you think that is?
I think there are a few different reasons, and you and I know that the Black community is not a monolith. So you're talking about, like, if you're looking at the Black faith community,
Yep.
for instance, there is a I don't know if what word I'm looking for here, but there are a lot of people who get sober through their churches.
Hmm.
They look at their drinking, they're brought into a pastor or a clergyman to look at their drinking, or a fellow who's gone through the process of getting sober through the church. And that seems to be an appropriate way to deal with it, is to kind of keep it in the community
Hmm.
and not go outside to one of these other sober support groups, but to go straight into the church, find your sobriety there, and then stay there
Yep.
with it. Um, and the Black faith community is very large. It's very large, and I think it's probably the predominant Black community. And I'm not just talking about Christianity, but any faith.
Sure.
Um, so I think that's one reason, is that we keep it in house that way. Another reason is, what I find with a lot of cultures, that even subcultures of Caucasians, which is, you don't talk about these things outside the family,
Yep.
and to ask for help is a sign of weakness, that is a sign of shame. So you're bringing shame on the family. One, if you're a drunk and you can't keep yourself together, that's a source of shame. But two, if you have to go tell people our business in order to get help with that. Nobody likes that. So you figure out another way. You just, like either be a man or be a woman and, think of your children or think of whatever, like whatever you need to do to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but you don't go and sit in these groups and tell people all your business like that. That just doesn't sit well with a lot of people, especially, um, my generation or even millennials. I think that there's an idea that mental health isn't paramount.
Yeah.
It doesn't come before everything. And I think Gen Z kind of has it right. Gen Z is quick to tell you when they need a mental health day.
Of
Like
course.
they're not showing up at work that day. But my generation and millennials, we were raised differently. I won't speak to millennials, but my generation, we were raised differently. And I'll be 60 in August and 16 in July,
Love that.
sobriety wise. So I I was raised with a very much, we keep it in house mentality in my culture, not in my home,
Yep.
but in my
It's
culture.
a
That
macro
was
issue
the
for
messaging.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think that's why I think that we don't talk about recovery outside of our communities. And not that recovery couldn't happen within the community in those sober support groups, but because those sober support groups are seen to be outside of our community, whatever those groups are, whether it be AA or Smart Recovery or the Tempest or We Are the Luckiest or what is Annie Grace's? Is this
This
Naked
naked mind.
Mind? Yeah. So there are all these different ways that people can get sober, but they all seem to be pretty white,
Yeah.
right? They
I
all,
don't think your assumption is off.
yeah. So the idea of sending somebody into that white community to get help is probably scary
Yeah.
too.
It's there's so much wrapped up into that. I think you're spot on. And I you know, when I think about that, and there's this term that keeps coming to my mind that, on an individual micro level and on a macro level, that silence is not a coping mechanism, right? And culturally speaking, everything that you said is entirely accurate. But this is, as we all know, is a symptom of such something much larger, right? So when you talk about actual healing within the broader context of recovery, all of the work that needs to be done, I don't know how an individual can do that or a culture can do that unless you're willing to put your laundry out, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how you can do it. So I'm here for the day when that pendulum starts shifting. I think it's starting to happen in a lot of ways, in the far reaching corners of Instagram where, people are talking about it and it's starting, maybe the algorithm will decide to give it some love at some point and it'll fly a little bit harder. Because my fear is that the opposite side of that coin is that recovery doesn't belong to us, that healing doesn't belong to us, right? Because we don't have either the spaces and we're not willing to go into the spaces that are embracing these conversations that we find really uncomfortable to have in the open. And
Yeah.
I think that that's really unfortunate, which is one of the reasons why I do think stash is really important. So I get it that a lot of white women are the ones reading your book. But the beautiful thing about books and all of these other pieces of media, hopefully, and content that we're all creating, is that they'll live long after we're gone, right? And someone 50 years from now who's looking for support, who's looking for that story to give them a little bit more hope and strength to take it to the next step, will find it, and perhaps they find that in stash. And if it weren't for you, that wouldn't exist.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that is exactly my hope too. And honestly, like since it's been out in paperback, I've been doing a lot of Black book clubs, which
Cool.
has been really, really satisfying to me. And I'm not just talking about like somebody who has a book club in their living room, every month. I'm talking about these nationwide, worldwide book clubs where they have like 55 chapters, and there are so many Black ones. And I've been really, really excited to start spreading the word, and they're finding my book. And it's book clubs really like fiction. So that's one of the challenges.
Yeah.
But the people who aren't challenged by that have been discovering it that way. So that's my hope, is that somebody struggling, somebody maybe who isn't even struggling, has heard of my book and recommends it to somebody who is struggling. And so they can either take whatever they need from it, but they can also feel that they're not alone. They're not the only one in the room.
Mhm. I love that.
Yeah.
This is an off the wall question, but being that you are a writer and an author, you started your first book is your memoir, right? What do you follow that up with? I mean, or do you have anything else in the queue that you're able to share? Or I'm curious where you go from there, considering you obviously get so much joy, both professionally and personally, out of writing. I don't know if those are one and the same with publishing, books, but where do you go from
Yeah.
from here with after Stash?
My publisher, who's the publisher at Atria, and my agent thought that Stash read so much like a novel that I should write fiction next.
Mm,
So I've turned in the second draft of that autofiction. It's called autofiction, which is autobiographical
okay.
fiction. And it's the setting is when I owned that PR firm in the 1990s with a fictional character who's really me,
It's great.
running the show. And I had these crazy experiences where, like, I was there at the first concert backstage with MTV when Puffy was, like, bringing Biggie out for the first time ever, and they
Mm.
were they were doing their choreography, and Biggie was so nervous, and I was literally feet away from them with a clipboard and a headset watching this happen. Shaquille O'Neal dated my assistant in my office, so he spent his whole first summer as a Laker in my office answering phones. And it was just like I had all these really kind of really cool, crazy stories from that time. So I use those as kind of a character. The book is called I Want Your Life, and it's about a betrayal.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I'll certainly keep my eyes and ears open for that when it comes down the pipe. Uh,
Excellent.
yeah. So I'm going to reel it back in here at back into our core subject matter and ask you just a few questions as we start to land the plane. Um,
Mhm.
One, I mean, a lot of the folks who I talk to on this show are 1, 2, 3, 4 years into their journeys, right? You obviously have much more time than that. My question is, at what point do you stop worrying about your sobriety and just like live in sobriety?
Mm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I totally know what you mean. Yeah, I mean, I think gosh, I'm so glad I don't have to get sober again.
Yeah.
Like, it was really hard.
Yeah.
It was really hard for me to get sober, and everything just felt so raw and new, and I just didn't know how to be, in my day-to-day life. Like, socially was weird for me. Um, sleep was terrifying for me. Like, all these things were really hard. Uh, what it looks like now for me is so good.
Mm,
It's so good. I love, love, love my life, and not because of the stuff that I have outside, like, because as you read in my book, I flew private. I had this huge house. I had a personal shopper. We had everything that I thought would make me happy, and I was miserable in that life.
mm,
And so I understood then when I got sober that it wasn't about the external stuff. But truly, I have this life where I'm social in a way that's really healthy for me. I travel, which is like one of my biggest loves. I'm really close to my kids. My kids are phone guys, which is amazing. They call me. We talk on the phone 2 or 3 times a day, both my
wow.
sons. Neither of them live with me. They are 26 and 24, but we're all in the same city. We're all in Los Angeles. And I've been with Scott since we left rehab, so we've been together for almost 16 years, and I have his 2 daughters that I call my bonus daughters. And every Sunday we have a family dinner and everyone comes over, and right now we're watching House of the Dragon, like, after we eat. But
Hmm.
every dinner, my brothers come. Like, it's this really big, wonderful jumble of spirited debates, and about everything from politics to Marvel movies. And and I don't ever feel the need to drink through any of it, and it never even occurs to me I've handled prescriptions for people, including Ambien, that have been like post-surgical, and I've never been tempted to take their stuff. This is in the later years.
Right.
I probably wouldn't have done that in my first couple years of sobriety. I'm sure I would have popped that Ambien if somebody had given me a bottle
Hmm.
when I was like 1 year sober. But yeah, where I am now, it's very clear for me that I have something that will take me away from my life if I indulge it, and I don't wanna be taken away from my life. I do a lot of life-affirming things because I really love my life. I work out 5 days a week, I food prep on Sundays, I write for a living, which is the most miraculous, wonderful thing. I can't wait to write, I can't wait to start writing. Like, that's what I get to do every day. And I have to be torn away from it at the end of the day. I love it. I love it. I teach writing. Like, I live and breathe writing, and I get to be a mama to my kids, and my parents are alive, and I get to be their daughter. Like, it's all really good, but it took me a solid 2 years to feel like, can I just enjoy this now? Can I just enjoy being sober? And really, honestly, up until about my 5th year, I was still adjusting.
Mm.
And I wasn't tempted all the time, but I wasn't solid, and I've been solid for the last 10 years.
Man, I honestly feel like I probably could talk to you for 3 hours. There's literally so many things that I want to talk to you about that I feel like if I get into it, you'll never get to lunch. So, so, um, um,
I appreciate that.
yeah, but thank you. I love all of that. I have two last questions that I literally ask
Mm.
everyone as we kind of close out. The first question is, in those days where you were struggling, you're at your worst. I have a sense of how you're going to answer this, but I'm going to ask anyways. You're at your worst. How would someone have known that you were struggling if you didn't tell them specifically?
My absence.
Mm,
I would cancel things all the time, and have brilliant excuses for it, but me making these appointments, these lunch appointments, these dates, these dinner dates that was like my authentic self saying, connect, connect, connect. And then the addict went and canceled them all because I either wasn't high enough or I was in withdrawal or whatever. And the more eventually I stopped making the dates
yeah, yeah,
because I knew that I wouldn't be able to make good on them, and it just wasn't any point anymore. So my absence was the way that you would know.
awesome. Thank you. Last question is for someone who's sitting there and they're just evaluating their own lives, taking audit, and recognize that they have some issues that they need to address, but they don't know what the first step could look like. What would you suggest to them?
I mean, if they have somebody in their lives whose recovery they admire, um, most people whose recovery I admire, they don't wear it on their sleeves. It's just kind of like, oh, they have this amazing life, and that's right, they don't drink.
Hmm.
How did they do that? And if they don't have anybody like that, that they can go to and just say, "What should I do?" I would show up at a 12-step meeting and see if there's anything there for them. Like I said, there are so many ways to get sober. There are all these sober support groups online. My friend Holly Whitaker, she's one of my best friends in the world.
Mm,
She started this group called The Temper, and it's called something else because someone else bought the company, but it's still a really good group. You just have to look it up. And then my friend Laura McCowan has the Luckiest Club, which is also, I haven't done the program, but I know a lot of people who swear by it. I've gone and talked to them via Zoom in their meetings and
hmm.
had just like this amazing time talking about what it used to be like, and then how all these people are coming together to support each other through getting better.
Mm,
I don't know how sustainable it is to do it alone.
yeah,
Um, and I know that people do it alone. I don't know how sustainable that is just because I don't have experience with that. But I do know that a lot of people have long-term recovery who have relied on communities to do it, which is exactly the thing I didn't want to do.
yeah.
So my advice, which I don't like to give advice, would be my experience, which was that I found a community, and that community helped me up until I could really look at myself and do the work that I needed to do to be in recovery.
Hmm. I love that. Thank you, Laura. We're gonna let you go so you can go get some sustenance. But before
Yes.
you do, for anyone who's listening and doesn't know who Laura is and where to find her, Laura, please let us know where we can get more of you and your story.
Yeah, everything's on my website. You pronounce my last name correctly, which almost no one does. It's Laura Cathcart Robbins, and I say Cathcart really. I'm enunciating that because people think it's Cathart or Catchart.
Mm,
I'll spell it for you. It's Laura, LauraCathcartRobbins.com. And everything's on there. All my classes, all my articles, the book, you can order it right from there. You can see where I'll be. I'll be in Boston later on this year,
cool.
and I'll be in the Berkshires, and I'll be at a couple of events in Los Angeles where I live. So check it out. Check out the events page and the calendar and the classes and the book.
Thank you, Laura. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time today. If I'm in any of these places that you happen to be talking at, I will certainly come by to say hello. It's been a complete gift to have you on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray.
Okay. I appreciate you guys listening to the Stacking Days podcast. I hope this episode added value to your recovery and wellness journey. Before we go our separate ways, let's connect on social. You can find us on TikTok and Instagram at Stacking Days or via the website www.stackingdays.com. By supporting the show, you can play a direct role in amplifying people of color in their pursuit of recovery. The easiest way to do that is to subscribe or hit the follow button. This way, you'll never miss an episode, all while playing an active part in creating the ecosystem where diverse voices and healing matter. This show is for the purpose of education and connection and is not a replacement for therapy or recovery care. For more information on the resources and support available, take a look at SAMHSA and some other resources shared in the description. Until we meet again, be well, one day at a time.